APUS History, Lesson 21, the Civil War. As many historians have argued, there's no real understanding of America after the Civil War without understanding the conflict itself. And it's so much of a tremendous watershed event in which everything after is different than everything that came before, that it's truly a central, pivotal moment in so many ways in our history. And to discuss this as a little backstory, how did we get here? Just some brief backstory on your first slide of 6 steps to war. Beginning with the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, you saw dissatisfaction in the northern states with the Fugitive Slave Act, which led to personal liberty laws and Uncle Tom's Cabin being written, which was an anti-slavery message to it. Following Uncle Tom's Cabin, you saw the Kansas-Nebraska Acts of 1854 with popular sovereignty, whereby you saw increasing escalating violence in Kansas as you had both pro and anti-slave forces trying to move into these areas to try to tip the balance one way or another for these states to be slave or free states on these frontier areas. The Dred Scott decision follows this in 1857, whereby slavery is essentially legalized throughout the Union, which horrifies the North. And in 1859, John Brown in his raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, tries to incite a slave insurrection, which in turn horrifies the South. And you've got two groups, Northern and Southern, that are increasingly talking past one another instead of talking to one another. And compromise becomes impossible. The election of 1860 bears this out with a extremely fractured 4-way race. The Whig Party, which had shattered in the 1850s, is now joined by the Democratic Party, which puts out a Northern Democratic candidate and a Southern Democratic candidate. And then you've got a Constitutional Union Party trying to just keep things as they already were in status quo. And the Republicans get a victory with less than 40% of the popular vote. When it comes to secession, then, why did the South do it? Why did they decide they had to leave? Simply put, the South had two arguments that were emotional and economic. As for the emotional one, they were convinced. They were convinced, as dominated by the radical wing of their own thinking, they were convinced that the North was trying to evince a master plan or plot to set up black rule in the South and essentially take away their rights, not just to slavery in the territories, but slavery everywhere, and make them slaves under a Northern system. Their economic argument, which is tied in somewhat with their own being convinced of the superiority of whites over blacks, white supremacy. Their economic argument was that the South needed slavery. They argued that the slaves were the peasant class of the South. And as such, it would be too costly to lose their property. There was no way they could sustain their way of life without it. They never liked the tariffs or the free soil nature of the territories. And they see all these things as hurtful to the South. For the northern part, then, why did the North not just say, fine, be gone? The reasons for that would lie in the fact that it would make the U.S. government weak. If the southern states could simply secede by leaving because essentially they'd lost an election, a popular, legally free and fair election, then any state could do it. Then the government would be like the old Articles of Confederation government, where nothing could be accomplished, and the government would be a fraud or a sham. And it gets back to that issue then of national supremacy and democratic rule. And the North is going to make the argument that this is a country, it's a nation, not a club that you can join and quit whenever you see fit. And Lincoln won fair and square. And so they argued for the South to walk away was simply a rejection of the constitutional principles of what a free democracy should be all about. As for conflict itself, on paper, had Las Vegas existed as a big gambling city some 200 years ago, and you'd went to get odds, 160 years ago rather, get odds on who was going to win the revolution, or the Civil War rather, it would have been like the revolution. On paper, it appears the North would have had all the advantages. For instance, the areas of red on this map, the red little blotches, indicate areas of industrial concentration. And the North had a vastly greater productive capacity than the South did. The state of Massachusetts alone, which on my map is about as big as my thumb, produced almost as much in total value of goods as virtually all the Confederate states put together. The North also had a far superior transportation system. These red lines are like arteries. They really are arteries, transportation arteries, tying the country together in ways that we had seen in earlier lessons, integrating the old Northwest with the industrial Northeast. As a nation state with capacity to integrate its overall total resources for a war effort, the North has vast advantages. Its population was larger than the South. Not only was its population larger in the South, about 2.5 to 1, but of those Southerners, 4.5 million were slaves, whom the Southerners couldn't really arm. At least not right away, they didn't think so. And so the Northern's population advantage was even greater. In terms of railroad mileage, coal production, iron production, textile production, raw manufactured goods, the North had every advantage in economic industrial capacity. It had an existing government. The South was creating a new government from scratch. The North had all the pre-existing institutions of a nation state. The North would have had far more naval tonnage. After all, New England was a seafaring community by disposition and by heritage. And so the North had all these vast economic advantages. But the North's economic advantages were not short-term. It would take time to turn them into advantages which could win a war and mobilize the country on a war footing. The South, curiously enough, had advantages of its own. And these advantages were like the advantages you saw during the American Revolution. On paper, it appears that the North hands down should win, which is why I made my mythical Las Vegas example. If you'd gone to Vegas and gotten odds, the odds would have been the North wins, and the North wins easily. It wasn't that easy, though, because like the Revolution, Great Britain seemed to be the heavy favorite. The Americans had some advantages. For every British advantage, there was a corresponding disadvantage. Among the Southern advantages, Southern culture, with its natural aristocratic background, had bred individuals who, by temperament and cultural attitude, were destined for command, were good at command. And as such, in the Army ground forces, much of the officer corps of the United States Army was made up of Southerners. There's an aristocratic tradition of sending your sons to military schools. The aristocratic elite of the South was a privileged elite that was supposed to lead. They were supposed to be in a position of authority and power and command. And as such, many of the leading officers of the United States Army, as Southerners, sided with their home states and stayed South. So the South had better generalship, at least initially at first. Secondly, like the American patriots, the South is more, in 1776, the South of 1860 is more motivated. This is a fight to defend, as they see it, their institutions, their way of life, their region of the country. And for the North to win, the North is going to need all those people because status quo, if the North does nothing, the South wins. The North has to actually go down there and physically haul them back into the Union. And so the North's going to need all those people and all those resources to go and do that. The war is going to be fought on Southern soil for the most part. They're going to have the home field advantage. They're going to know the area, having a sympathetic population. And additionally, they have cotton and lots of it, which makes them a one-crop economy, but also it's a very good trading item with all the major nations of the industrialized developed nations of Europe who needed and sought that cotton for their textile mills and their cotton mills. So with these short communication lines and these more motivation in fighting this defensive war, the Southern advantages are more substantial than most people gave them credit for, in the North at least, when the war began. So the Northern limitations, as we discussed, involved having to go down there and do the heavy lifting of putting this Union back together again. How was the North going to accomplish this? Initially, the Northern strategy, and I want to take time out from it to discuss a few things about the exam for you before I get into that. Remember that as we've seen in earlier lessons, and your own instructors have probably told you, when it comes to military conflicts in the AP exam, the exam does not stress bullets and bombs. The exam does not stress troop layouts, command decisions, strategy, tactics, etc. So we will not be engaging in a great detailed conversation of those events, just as we have not for the Revolutionary Unit reviews and for the War of 1812 reviews. What the exam concerns itself with heavily is causes and consequences, which is why your previous lessons have been structured and built in the way they were, placing so much weight on the steps that led us to this great division. Now that we're at the division, we'll go through the military part of it rather quickly and talking about the parts that you need to address for the exam itself in a few specific ways. Now, back to task. Northern strategy. Northern strategy for winning the war was going to be, ultimately, it was going to be a war of attrition and resources where the North was going to, over time, have greater and greater strength to grind down the South. No one on either side anticipated this first. Everyone thought the war was going to be over in 6 to 8 weeks, that the other side was bluffing, no one was going to fight, it would be easy, there would be very little blood, there'd be plenty of glory. All the typical things you hear of those who are all too innocent of what the combat and the terrible things that are coming are actually really going to look like. So the North's strategy over time to win the war winds up having a few parts to it. It's about a 3 to 4 part strategy. Part 1, is going to involve the North using its superior naval resources. Remember, as we had said, the South had stronger military leadership in terms of the armed forces, the Army, their officers of the Army. The North retained the bulk of the naval forces because by culture and background, most of the majority of the sailors were Yankees. They'd come from that culture, come from that background. The North was going to deploy these forces in the form of a blockade around the South. This was the so-called Anaconda Plan. Like an anaconda snake, the idea was to wrap the tentacles around the South and squeeze the life out of the South. Remember, the South as an economy, while it's very productive in a free market system, is very weak as a self-sustaining system. They're an export-driven economy. They must export their cotton. They make very little in the way of finished produced industrial goods, let alone wartime goods, cannons, muskets, uniforms, gunpowder, etc. So to blockade the South would effectively shut the South off from external resources that could aid them. Secondly, the Northern plan was a bit of divide and conquer. Divide the South along the Mississippi, seize and gain control of the Mississippi River, which essentially slices the South in two. Divide it off and then roll it up from one side or the other. Third of all was to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. This will be the Army commander Robert E. Lee. This would be referenced in military terms as breaking off the tip of the spear. If I have a spear and I'm going to attack you and you break the tip off of it, I still have a weapon, but it's not nearly as effective of a weapon. So destroy the Confederacy's most potent and dangerous military force, which was the Army of Northern Virginia. And fourth of all, at all costs, prevent European recognition of the Confederacy. Remember, it was European recognition of the United States in the war against Great Britain, the Revolution, that made American existence possible. After the Battle of Saratoga, France and Spain and the Netherlands all started to gradually give increasing aid to the United States in their struggle. If the United States can deny formal recognition by great European powers to the Confederacy, that's a huge leg up for the Northerners to win. As for the South, Southern strategy and goals were different. Southern strategy initially was to play for time. They thought the longer the war went on, the better it was for them, like their forefathers in the American Revolution. The war drug on, England got sick of it, they lost their motivation, will to fight. Secondly, stay alive. Stay alive and stay a nation. Every day that the war goes on and the South continues to exist is a day closer to victory for them, because all they want is existence. They don't have to conquer the North. They don't have to occupy the North to win. Their winning will be simply described as leave us alone. And so Southern victory is existence. And every day the war goes on and they still exist is a day closer to that goal. And thirdly, their main primary objective is the reverse of the North on European recognition. Get Europe drug into this war somehow, some way, at all costs. That becomes the real motivating tool for them. As a tool they sought to use in this, the South thought they could use their cotton exports and hold Europe hostage. By withholding the cotton, they thought the Union blockade would actually work to their advantage, that English and French textile mills would have all their people unemployed in the streets, and that would compel the British governments to get involved. However, in issues of grain shipments, King Corn actually wound up defeating King Cotton. The need that European nations had for food shipments that were coming from, as we previously mentioned, that breadbasket of the Great Lakes region, the Old Northwest, food shipments from there in the form of excess corn that was being imported back to Europe was of more importance to these European nations and of more value to them in terms of their sustenance and survival than cotton. The European nations were able to get cotton from other providers, other suppliers in a global market, and so King Corn, as the Northerners gleefully discovered as the war went on, was stronger than and going to defeat King Cotton in this struggle to maintain recognition or non-recognition status of the South.